They have asked me, as you can see, to talk about a current topic. I will talk about the plague, essentially in a strict sense, that is, the disease that at a certain point was recognized and described by science, and that at certain periods in our history has, so to speak, accompanied our ancestors. The plague, well, if you go look it up in an encyclopedia or on Wikipedia, it will tell you that the plague is an infectious disease of bacterial origin, caused by a bacillus called Yersinia pestis. It is a disease of bacterial origin. I would invite you to reflect on this aspect, which is fundamental. In these months, even, those of us who are less inclined towards scientific subjects have learned, for example, that there is a big difference between bacteria and viruses. Now I apologize in advance to the doctors who are surely present in the room. It's always said that there is a doctor in the room. I apologize to the doctors for the roughness of my reasoning. But what I have learned is that we often struggle to treat viral diseases, as has been seen, while for diseases caused by bacteria, we have a formidable weapon, which is antibiotics. Antibiotics are not effective for diseases caused by viruses, but they are for diseases caused by bacteria, of course. Today there is a whole discussion about the fact that bacteria are also becoming stronger, and that it is no longer so obvious that antibiotics work. But the fact remains that since the 1940s, we have been able to treat diseases caused by bacteria to a certain extent. Better said, not those caused by viruses. We can treat the plague today. A plague epidemic seems paradoxical, but we will be able to treat it better than the epidemic. We have gone through and are currently experiencing. The plague is a disease carried by animals. It is a disease that has rodents as its main reservoir, typically mice in our past. The rats that lived in houses, in buildings, which still often inhabit them, but in the past. There were sometimes more in the crowded neighborhoods of ancient cities or in country houses. The rats, but also other rodents. We will talk about them again. Wild rodents, for example. The prairie squirrels in America. There you go. That is the basin. The plague develops there and is then transmitted to humans in its most common form. Bubonic plague, which is transmitted to humans by fleas that, after biting an already sick rat, bite a human and transmit. The bacterium. The encyclopedic part will end soon, but let's still say this. The plague typically presents itself in two forms, the most common, the most widespread, and also the one we all have in mind, the bubonic plague. Bubonic plague, which means that when someone gets sick, their lymph nodes swell, particularly those in the armpits and groin. This symptom deeply impressed people in the past, and rightly so. And it is what gave the name bubonic plague. However, let's be clear, the swelling of the lymph node is a positive thing in itself, because it means that the lymph node is doing its job, trying to stop the spread of the disease in the body. And it is only when it fails that bubonic plague becomes deadly, because at that point, septicemia sets in. When septicemia occurs, there is also a blockage of the capillaries, essentially leading to blood coagulation, where it shouldn't happen throughout the body. As a result, bruises and black spots appear on the skin, and there is necrosis of the fingers and limbs, which is probably why it was at one point called the Black Death. Then there is the other form, which is actually more severe because bubonic plague has a very high mortality rate. But the one with the highest lethality overall is the plague. When it becomes pneumonic plague has a difference. And you will see that this matters in history. There is a fundamental difference. Bubonic plague requires a flea to transmit it. The pneumonic plague, no. The pneumonic plague is like COVID. That is why we wear masks, because it is transmitted through saliva. And the pneumonic plague has an even higher lethality than bubonic plague. I also had a list of symptoms. I seemed to catch a glimpse of them. But I don't know. You know, in our imagination, the plague is laden with horrors. Obviously, it is a terrifying disease, but for example, I remember having seen films, dramas, or documentaries where they show plague victims experiencing all sorts of things, blood eruptions and so on. It's not like that. In reality, apart from the buboes, the plague also has the symptoms of a terrible pneumonia. You experience fever, headaches, joint pain, nausea, and when it worsens, drowsiness, lethargy, delirium, and suffocation. After that, as Paola Farinetti rightly said, in our language and in various languages, at least in the Indo-European ones. To be honest, I have no idea about non-Indo-European languages, but in our languages, the term plague or its equivalents have always been used. In ancient Greek, it seems to be loimos. When the plague breaks out in Athens, someone remembers an old oracle. I no longer know which of the Greek oracles which said, and they are in the Peloponnesian War against the Spartans, thus against the Dorians. And the oracle said that the war of the Dorians will come, and with it the plague. Now, in this sense, in our languages, it generally referred to the epidemic disease, the disease with very high mortality and highly contagious. Then today, instead of turning to oracles, we seek scientists to believe in. We now look at how certain epidemics of the past, which have always been called the plague, are described, and upon examining them, we find that this stuff was not actually the plague. The plague of Athens, in which Pericles died, the plague of Athens was probably typhus. Another disease, another epidemic, that has gone down in history because it had a very strong impact, like the plague, is the Antonine plague. And the plague that devastates the Roman Empire starting from the reign of Marcus Aurelius. The imperial family was the family of the Antonines, which is why it is referred to in history books as the Antonine plague. It was not actually the plague. We are not entirely sure whether it was smallpox or measles, which may almost make us smile because we are used to considering measles a childhood disease. In reality, historically, measles, when it arrives in a population that has never encountered it, where there is no one immunized, is a terrifying and devastating disease. It was partly responsible for the depopulation of America after the arrival of European colonists, for example. Therefore, the Antonine plague that devastates the Roman Empire between the 2nd and 3rd centuries is perhaps smallpox, perhaps measles. They know nothing about it. For them, it is the plague, and it is a disease that has effects, an epidemic that has powerful historical effects, because the Roman Empire finds itself short of manpower. The Roman Empire is short on population, not everywhere, not always, but this is something that continues in waves for generations. It becomes normal in the Roman Empire for there to be areas where there are not enough people. What does it mean that there aren't enough people? It means that the landowners are complaining. We don't have farmers. We can't cultivate all our lands. These complaints are directed to the tax office, of course. To clarify, I am sorry, but we can no longer pay the same taxes that we paid in previous years. And then who is complaining? The commanders of the legions are complaining. We have no recruits. We are short on people. At that time, the Roman Empire, the government of the Roman Empire, and the ruling class of the Roman Empire made a decision that would allow the empire to survive for centuries, which was to allow immigrants to enter. Here, there is no propaganda for one thesis or the other at a political level, of course. But it is a fact that the Roman Empire, for generations and generations, fills its gaps by bringing in people. There is a whole political and ideological shift in this sense. It integrates them and makes them work or recruits them into the army. And for centuries, the Roman Empire responds to the plague with these countermeasures. Afterward, the plague as we know it, as described by scientists today, caused by Yersinia pestis, appeared in our world for the first time towards the end of the barbarian invasions. We are in the 6th century. in Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Empire, during the time of Emperor Justinian, who compiled the laws of the Roman emperors in the Corpus Juris Civilis. As it devastates Constantinople and the empire during Justinian's reign, it goes down in history as the Justinian plague. But then, like the plague does, it reappears. The plague appears with a first great overwhelming epidemic, and then returns, coming back after a few years, reappearing in one area, perhaps not the same, but in another. And for centuries, it accompanies the lives of people. For centuries, it is a constant danger and a factor that reduces the population, preventing it from increasing, as human populations do when left in peace. If there are no external threats, we proliferate, grow, and multiply as prescribed by the Bible. However, after the Justinian plague of the 6th century, for a couple of centuries, the plague continues to be present in Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Arab world, which means that those centuries are centuries of stagnation. There is no growth, no demographic growth, and no economic growth either. Then, around 750 AD, it disappears. In 750 AD, there was a boy who was probably 8 years old at the time, and his name was Charles, who would later be called Charlemagne. The Empire of Charlemagne is, so to speak, the first great event in Europe where the plague is no longer present. Where the plague is no longer present, and where it is not just a matter of an emperor who is a great general, has great ambitions, and makes great conquests and reforms, but it is also a matter of a population that is no longer ravaged by the plague and can therefore begin to grow again. It was not spoken of for centuries. In 750, the Middle Ages had just begun. We could say the centuries leading up to 750 are indeed centuries of decline, stagnation, and depopulation. They can somewhat correspond to the fantastical image of the Middle Ages as dark centuries that everyone has in mind. But after that, no. From Charlemagne onwards, Europe experienced centuries of uninterrupted growth, not only in population, but also in cultural, economic, and technological development. Europe began to have ships that would one day carry Columbus to America, along with navigational tools like compasses and navigation systems. It discovered routes to Asia and sent Marco Polo to China, but he was not the only one. Many others followed. Europe, through the Crusades, regardless of one's agreement or disagreement with the impetus of the Crusades, ventured out to invade other continents, a trend that would continue to increase for centuries. It is therefore a medieval Europe accustomed to growth. Generations and generations, certainly starting from a very low point, but then they built everything that remains of the Middle Ages to us. Towers, castles, churches, works of art. And they were, how can I put it, in full growth and full optimism when the plague returned. The second wave of the plague, the true plague, Yersinia pestis, in our history, is the one that arrives in Europe in 1347-48, as described by Boccaccio in the framework of the Decameron. We will discuss it in depth. And it is an epidemic that, so to speak, delivers an absolutely unexpected blow to a medieval world that, I repeat, although it was starting to face some difficulties due to overpopulation and the struggle to feed everyone. There were many fewer of them than us, but they obviously did not have our technologies. Before the plague arrives, there are a few decades during which it is evident that famines are more frequent. The poor are eating less well, yet they are still all riding the wave of a very long period of growth in living memory. There is nothing but growth. And then, suddenly, the epidemic cuts their legs out from under them. I don't know if any of you remember the Siena Cathedral. The Siena Cathedral is an immense church, far too large for how Siena is today. And when it was built, it could accommodate the entire population of Siena which was a very rich and prosperous city where a lot of money circulated in 1300. At a certain point, the people of Siena, who had finished building this immense cathedral, which is disproportionate even today, said, let's make one much larger. Because if we continue to grow, Siena, head of the world in short, which no one can stop, plans to build a new cathedral, of which the existing one will only be the transept. You are present, right? The short arm of the cross in the layout of a church, and they begin. When one goes to Siena, they usually don't notice it because there are 1,000 things to see. The next time you go, look at the side of the cathedral. A very tall wall emerges, a piece of wall. There are already 2 windows ready. They have already made a piece of marble cladding, and then stopped there. The plague also arrived in Siena, killing half of the population. And the business turnover afterwards was never the same as before. In short, it did not continue. That piece of wall remains to remind us of the ambitions and optimism of what was the municipality of Siena before the plague. Afterward, the plague, as I mentioned, has this characteristic of arriving with a first devastating epidemic, but then it does not disappear. It returns. The plague returned in the 1300s, in the second half of the 1300s, every 10-15 years. Though not with the same impact as the first time, it still returned. It no longer spread throughout all of Europe, but affected specific areas. Perhaps 20 years later, it appeared in another area, but each time it took lives, not as many as before, but it still claimed lives every time. The result is that the European population is unable to recover. Do you know that after a single disaster, the natural tendency of the human population is to mate and have children? Think of the baby boom after World War II. The largest generation ever to appear in the world right after the end of the greatest disaster in human history, which was likely World War II. They don't make it because the plague returns. The result is that during the Renaissance, the European population can be estimated to be about half of what it was in the Middle Ages. Europe has literally been emptied. And things go on like this for a long time. Although the violence of the plague is held back, contained by measures of every kind, I will discuss this further towards the end. So its virulence is no longer the same, but never completely exhausts itself and is capable of return. It goes back to the full 1600s, even to the beginning of the 1700s. So, let's say 3 abundant centuries, during which about 15 generations of our grandparents lived in a world where, among the 1,000 problems one had to face, there was also the fact that you never know when it might resurface. However, there is clearly a human capacity to contain it, to prevent its spread, and to reduce contagion. The last major epidemics known, in the second half of the 1600s and the beginning of the 1700s, are all contained epidemics that were managed within a single city. The plague of London. In 1665, the plague of Copenhagen. In 1711, that kills 1/3 of the population of Copenhagen, however, does not emerge. The last plague in Europe is the Marseille plague of 1720, which affects Marseille and also a bit of Provence. But they managed to stop it. We will talk about it later. I'm not just talking about masks, but we are there, and then that's it. And then in Europe, it disappears completely. In Europe, elsewhere, no. When did the doctors study it? When did they identify the bacillus, Yersinia pestis? They studied it when the plague returned in a big way, but let's say we can talk about it again. The plague returned at the end of the 1800s in India, in China. And it returned and stayed there, not for centuries, but for decades. The plague devastated India roughly until the outbreak of the First World War. In China, it continued even beyond that. In the early 1920s, there was pneumonic plague in Manchuria, and it is there that it was studied in a modern way. It is called Yersinia pestis because in 1894, when there was a plague in Hong Kong, a bacteriologist, who I believe was half French and half Swiss, and perhaps of Russian origin, named Alexandre Yersin, isolated the plague bacillus, the plague bacterium, Yersin, Yersinia pestis, until the 1800s, early 1900s. If any of you are wondering when it completely disappeared, know that it has not disappeared at all. The bubonic plague is still present in the world. Thank you. On average, about 600 cases of bubonic plague are reported worldwide each year. And we treat them, so not everyone dies. Some do die as always, but the vast majority recover. About 600 cases of the bubonic plague, with the latest statistics indicating an average of around 100 deaths per year. In all continents except Europe and Oceania. The good news is that the bubonic plague is still endemic in the other continents. The plague is present in the United States, where the last epidemic was in Los Angeles in 1924, resulting in 30 deaths. The epidemic is certainly different compared to the past, but those who remember the cholera outbreak in Naples in the 70s, for example, also recall that there were about 30 deaths, but the emotional impact was significant. 30 deaths in Los Angeles in 1924. But since then, the plague has not left the United States, with an average of 7 cases of bubonic plague each year in the country. Very few deaths, but 4 deaths in 2015. The plague in the United States is endemic among prairie rodents in southwestern Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Southern California. And there, in the countryside, it happens every year that a farmer gets bitten by a flea that has just bitten an infected squirrel or mouse. And as proof of what I was saying earlier about the fact that we should not imagine the symptoms, the frightening aspect of the plague is its mortality. The symptoms themselves are as unpleasant as those of any serious disease that can kill you. They are not easily recognizable. There is a whole history in the United States of misdiagnoses. When the epidemic occurred in Los Angeles, in BIA, in 1924, the initial diagnoses were pneumonia or venereal disease due to the buboes in the groin. And even recently, there have been cases where the plague was diagnosed as acute appendicitis or meningitis. It's not that easy, of course. After that, as I was saying, the bubonic plague is present in our history and culture, starting from the Great Plague of 1348. And I would like to take a little more time to talk about that epidemic and to reflect on that epidemic. The plague of 1348 is a shocking event that affects all contemporaries. Of course, as soon as it ends, people start working again and move on. But while it lasts, it is an event that truly leaves a huge impression, which means there are countless chroniclers and literary figures of the time who talk about it. We in Italy have the one who described it better than anyone else, and that is Boccaccio. Did you know that Boccaccio, setting his Decameron around this idea, mentioned 10 young people, 7 girls, and 3 young men who go to the countryside to spend some time in the countryside? How can I justify something like that? Especially the fact that girls go out with male friends. This is a problem. In fact, the idea comes from, let me show you the frame of the Decameron. The idea starts with the 7 girls. Then there are some young men, their friends, who are also a bit in love, saying, but we would come too. And suddenly the girls say, but excuse me, then people talk, it's not done in their world. It's not done. But the plague has suspended all the rules a bit. Those who are rich go to the countryside, to their villas, to distance themselves from the infected city. And thus, Boccaccio works on this pretext. And this being the pretext of the Decameron, he tells us, the contemporaries knew it, but he tells it for posterity, what that epidemic was. It was 1348, he says, when the deadly pestilence arrived in the noble city of Florence, more illustrious than any other Italian city. A few years earlier, it had begun in the eastern parts. They spoke like this in the 14th century. You know that it was Boccaccio who had a passion for writing, with Latin syntax, placing the verb at the end. And so there is always the verb at the end, which was not, I repeat, the normal usage of Italian in his time. It began in the East, years before. In those eastern parts, Asia, having been deprived of countless lives, without stopping from one place to another, Continuing on, do you understand what it is telling us? It is telling us that they knew it was coming. It had begun years earlier in Asia, and they had continuous relations with Asia, commercial relations, practically only commercial, let's say, but they had them. And how? So it was known. It was known that this thing existed, and it was known that it was moving, that it was not staying still, that it was coming towards us. And since they knew it was coming, they tried to take measures. Boccaccio describes those in Florence, which was one of the most modern and advanced places in the world. It is not said that everywhere they thought to do the same things, but in Florence they did. What do they do in Florence, knowing that there is this disease in Asia that is moving and coming towards us? At a certain point, they decide that the city needs to be cleaned of garbage. They have no idea about the causes of the contagion, but they sensibly believe that hygiene would help. Therefore, cleaning the city in an Italian municipality like Florence means creating an office responsible for removing garbage from the city, and they do it. Boccaccio, however, before listing these measures, has already taken care to say that it was all for nothing. Nothing we did was useful. What did we do? Remove the garbage, of course. It is forbidden for any sick person to enter, meaning that when someone entered, it was checked that they were not ill, and that was acceptable. And many recommendations were given for the preservation of health. What does this mean? At a certain point, they must have called the doctors, the physicians, and asked them, what do you think we should do? And the doctors will have each given their opinion, their viewpoint. Boccaccio says it was of no use. And then there is the other set of countermeasures. That was of no use in the same way. Humble supplications, not once but many times, made in orderly processions and in other forms, to God by devoted people. Now pay close attention. This is obviously the reaction we might expect the most, because based on our stereotypes about the people of the Middle Ages, we might have expected them to create a health office a bit less. We do expect them to hold processions. They will continue to do so even afterwards, and the Enlightenment thinkers will laugh at it just as Manzoni laughs in The Betrothed, at the fact that in Milan they hold processions hoping to ward off the epidemic, of course. But note well, Boccaccio does not say, and we all started to pray. The devout people did that. That was a world where everyone was a believer. But even there was a clear difference between those who said, look, at this point, I'm going to pray, and those who said, excuse me, let's listen to the doctors and see what they say. However, the fact remains that it was of no use. The plague arrived. In the spring of the predicted year, it horrifically began to show its painful effects, unlike in the East, where, in Asia, as far as they knew from the news they had, anyone who had a nosebleed was a clear sign of inevitable death. This is very interesting because if it's true, and it can't have been made up, it means that in Asia, it was the pneumonic plague. Because it is the pneumonic plague that makes you, how should I put it, vomit blood, not the bubonic plague. And so, if this is true, the plague was pneumonic in Asia. Instead, when it arrives here, it is the bubonic plague. Boccaccio describes it clearly. He says, no, there was no such thing as vomiting blood or losing blood from the nose, he says. But indeed, certain swellings would arise on the groin or under the armpits, some of which grew like a common apple, and others like an egg, some larger and some smaller, which the common people referred to as gavoccioli. The common people, that is, those who spoke Italian, there wasn't a word for it. They had to invent one, as this disease had never been seen before. And while we say the bubo, the Florentines initially call it something else when this thing arrived. The gavocciolo, the deadly gavocciolo. And after the buboes appeared, there would come black or livid spots on the arms and thighs, in every other part of the body, a certain sign of impending death. What else does Boccaccio say? He says that everyone started to think about how to cure this disease. Never have so many self-proclaimed medical experts been seen as at that moment. Even then, Knowing how it all ended, he says, "It was all useless, everyone ignorant." The ignorance of the doctors, of whom, in addition to the number of scientists, there were then all the others. What does it mean? This means that in that world, the doctors existed and had studied for years and years at the university. They were graduates, solemn, very well paid, and they could do some things, managing well in certain aspects of surgery. They had understood certain things, but unfortunately, the studies they had undertaken were based on the doctrine of the human body, inherited from the ancients. It is not a matter of medieval ignorance. Here lies the legacy of the Greek and Roman world, which had transmitted to the medieval universities a very interesting view of the human body, all based on the balance of humors, the balance of blood, bile, heat, and cold. Very interesting, but fundamentally not useful for curing diseases. And so the scientists, as Boccaccio says, were highly respected and well paid, yet they were unable to cure the plague. But they were not successful either, he says, even the others, of whom the number had become very great, both of women and men, without having ever received any medical knowledge. In other words, it is full of people who pretend to be healers, convinced that they can provide care. And you notice this among both women and men. If women are placed in the first position, it means that it was very common for there to be women who thought or who tried, who engaged in caring for the sick. And it is not a coincidence, because in reality, while the solemn doctor who graduated from the university was always a man, in their mental horizon, being beside the sick was one of the things that women normally knew how to do and did. You know, that was obviously a patriarchal, male-dominated society where the roles were very separate. All public roles, work, politics, and war were performed by men. The woman is associated with private spaces, certainly the home, the various children, but she also has in their mentality total responsibility for the two crucial moments of life, birth, and death. Birth is obvious. It is she who has it in her belly. However, perhaps what is a bit less obvious is that at the moment of childbirth, it is all women. At the time of childbirth, the sisters, friends, and neighbors come to be with the mother, to comfort her, help her, and offer suggestions. There are also those who are knowledgeable, who have seen other births with men out of the way. It was the same when it came to illness and death. The sick always had women around them. And when someone died, it was the women who mourned and took care of preparing the body for burial. It was something completely officialized, in the sense that if a man had poked his nose in, the women would have told him to get lost. This is something we do. In fact, there is a specific case. I digress a little, but I will tell you about it. Dante recounts it in The New Life. It happened to him. Do you remember Dante? Young, very young, hopelessly in love with Beatrice, who looks for every opportunity to see her. It's not that easy. Beatrice, as long as she is to be married, stays shut up at home, as was customary in Florence. And when she is married, she is a married woman. And he, on the other hand, who is the same age, is just a boy. She is a married woman, 18 years old, an adult, a mother of a family, a housekeeper. He is still a lost boy, in love, looking for every opportunity to see her. Beatrice's father dies, and Dante goes to the Portinari's house to see if he can somehow see Beatrice. Beatrice is inside the house crying, and Dante recounts this. I arrived there, but couldn't enter, because as is customary, while the women go in to cry with the family, the men stay outside. So he remained outside with the other men, thinking of Beatrice who was inside and her pain. He says it made him want to cry, and he tried not to let himself be seen, because he felt a bit ashamed. When the women who had been inside crying with Beatrice come out and see him crying, they scold him, saying, "Let us cry. We have seen how Beatrice is suffering, how she is in pain. We cry, and what are you doing out here? Why are you crying? You are a man." At this point, we understand what the true transformation of all habits caused by the epidemic really means. It's not that as I speak, more and more masks are going up in the audience, right? Thank you. It's an unintended effect. I'm quite far away, and I hope I can manage without one, because speaking would really be a bit difficult. No, I was saying, do you understand what it means to have all values upended by the epidemic when Boccaccio says that the sick were left alone, dying alone, without women around them? Not only did people die without having many women around them, but there were also many who passed away from this life without any witnesses. And for a man of that time, it is an inconceivable thing. One never dies alone. One always dies with people around. And at the last moment, women... Now, what other things does Boccaccio say about this disease that we can reason about? It describes, we have seen the symptoms, but then it describes other characteristics of the epidemic that are indisputable and are the same things that other chroniclers across Europe recount. First, the mortality rate is extremely high. Few of those who become ill recover. Not only did few recover, but almost all did not. Within 3 days of the appearance of the signs, some died sooner, and some later, and most without any fever or other symptoms. Here one begins to say they are without fever, as it has been described by our doctors since the end of the 1800s. How is the fever present? Well, let's move on. It is extremely contagious. And this plague was particularly powerful because it would leap from the sick to the healthy. Always Boccaccio, it would leap. Just as fire acts on dry or oily things when they are brought very close to it. Do you understand? Their feeling is that just getting close to someone who is sick means you will catch it too. It jumps on you, like fire catches when you put a greasy piece of paper next to it. Therefore, not only did speaking with the sick or doing anything with them make you ill, but it was enough to touch their clothes or anything else they had touched for it to jump upon you. We will also compare this with the bubonic plague brought by fleas as we know it today. Finally, Boccaccio says, but others say it too, it also killed animals. Boccaccio says, I saw it myself. I saw the domestic animals. I saw 2 pigs in the street. They had thrown away the rags of a poor man who had died of the plague. The pigs started grunting, and then both fell dead, as if they had taken poison. Now, this last point is one of those cases where I would reserve my judgment. But Boccaccio, listen, you are a storyteller. I would bet my hand on this matter because it truly clashes with everything we know, because the plague does not transmit to that type of domestic animals. But anyway. In short, the things I have told you about Boccaccio confirmed by other witnesses not only in the 14th century, but also throughout all the plagues we have known in Europe up to Marseille in 1720, are also supported by all the studies conducted for the 14th century. It is difficult, but later on, it is possible to exhume plague victims and also to obtain statistics. In a small village in the 1600s, the parish priest had the habit of recording every birth, every marriage, and every burial in a book. So at that point, you can create statistics. Well, until the beginning of the 1700s, the plague, as we have known it in Europe, is a highly contagious disease. So much so that it strikes families and devastates them. Statistics have been made on this. When can you do it? Are the plague victims generally the only ones in their family who die, or do others usually die when one person dies of the plague? In the second response, it is noted that others from the same family also die, and it spreads through direct, immediate contact between humans. It is not only highly contagious, but also has an extremely high mortality rate. Now, for some time, historians have been saying everything is fine, but what the doctors are telling us is not quite this. The doctors who described the plague in China and India at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century did not see these things. The only true parallel is the buboes. But otherwise, bubonic plague, for example, in India, has been studied for its transmission, which is very slow. In India in 1896, there were railways that did not exist in Europe in the 300s, and yet the plague advances very slowly and is not very contagious from person to person, Not very contagious. It is normal for someone to be unwell in the family. You can take them to the hospital in time, isolate them, and the rest of the family can remain calm. Even more extraordinary, during these major plague epidemics of the 19th, 20th centuries in China and India, treated already by Western doctors and nurses, there were still no antibiotics, so they treated as best as they could. Yet the medical personnel rarely fell ill. Doctors and nurses are continuously in contact with the sick and do not fall ill. Why? Because it requires the flea. And as it happens, but it's not so obvious, that as soon as you get close to a sick person, there is a flea that has just bitten them and jumps onto you and bites you. It takes a lot, in short. It's not like the droplets. Now we've all learned that they are called droplets of saliva. Loaded. No, that's not it. Then, the mortality is also different. The bubonic plague that struck Europe in the past is a disease that devastates a locality once it takes hold. The plague in Copenhagen in 1711 caused 22,000 deaths out of 60,000 inhabitants of the city, a third in just a few months. Now, the plague that swept through India and China in the 8th and 19th centuries caused a lot of deaths, and when I tell you the number, you will be amazed. However, you must consider how much time it took and the immense populations of those countries. The plague in India from 1896 to 1914 caused 12 million deaths, which means 4% of the population over 20 years. You understand that the plague as we know it would exterminate a third of the population in 6 months. This is not a common measure. There is little to be done. Even today, bubonic plague thrives in tropical climates because in cold climates, fleas cannot survive. Therefore, the southwestern United States, Peru, and Madagascar are currently the reservoirs of bubonic plague. The historical plague from the 300s to the 600s was also devastating in Scandinavia. Bubonic plague, being linked to the life cycles of fleas, is fundamentally a summer disease. With the first cold weather, it decreases and disappears. In contrast, the historical plague does not behave this way. The historical plague is capable of breaking out suddenly and devastating the population even in the middle of winter. One last thing, indeed. Medieval chroniclers and writers like Boccaccio mentioned that dogs, cats, and pigs were dying. This greatly surprises our scientists today, I must say. But no one mentions that the rats were dying, which is, instead, the most striking aspect of the plague epidemics known in modern times. So much so that Albert Camus did a tremendous job in his novel, The Plague, that some of you may have read. I reread it, I confess, during this time, although it is a bit trivial. But by chance, I found it in my hands while organizing some books, and I said to myself, look, I'll read it again. Do you know what Camus does? In the 1940s, Camus wrote this novel, The Plague, in which he imagines the plague breaking out in a modern city, in his case, Oran in Algeria, and thus a fully French city in the 1940s. Full of French people. Cars, shops, trains, newspapers, and everything else. Here, imagine the plague breaking out in one of our cities. But the real plague, the bubonic one, the one that kills half of the city's population. And having studied well, he describes it with extreme clinical precision. What he shows is certainly what was happening with the bubonic plague in India and China at the end of the 19th century, the one we know, in short. What happens? One fine day, the protagonist leaves home, staying in an apartment building, goes out of the house, walks down the stairs, and finds a dead mouse on the stairs. He goes to the doorman and tells him to clear away this mess. The doorman obeys. The next day, she goes down the stairs finding 2 dead mice on the steps with blood on their faces. She goes to the doorman, and the doorman says, "Oh, you know, this is happening all over the neighborhood. They are everywhere. Look, now even in the street. May God help us." A few days later, the protagonist, who is a doctor, has to go visit the doorman who suddenly fell ill. And he finds him in bed with a very high fever and swelling. There you go. This is how the plague breaks out. Now, no author, neither medieval nor later, has ever noted that before the spread of the plague, rats would come out to die in the streets. Is it possible? You might expect me to say that we know exactly why there are all these oddities. That's not the case at all. We don't know. But the point is that today we describe the plague caused by Yersinia pestis, and we are not really sure that it was exactly that thing, the one that swept across Europe from the Middle Ages to the modern age. It was probably a form of the same thing, but it has changed. This is another thing we have learned, that the effects of diseases change in our modern age, where everything changes so quickly, even from one month to the next. It has changed. It no longer corresponds. The other question one would naturally want to answer is, why did it disappear from Europe after the beginning of the 18th century? Here we try to provide an answer. It is not absolute certainty, but we are getting there. The plague has gradually lost its effectiveness, and this is not a government advertisement, because human countermeasures, although they were not able to cure it, have managed to contain it and prevent it from spreading. The countermeasures were developed from the very beginning in Europe, particularly starting from Italy. We have already seen the preventive measures, even though Boccaccio says they were of no use. However, the officials, that is, the personnel responsible for clearing away the garbage, and so on, when they realized that the plague did not just arrive that first time and then go away, but returns, they quickly deploy all the countermeasures that we have put in place on this occasion. Just as they invented them, they were invented at the end of the Middle Ages, in the early modern age. That is, as soon as someone falls ill, isolate them. Do not let them go around. Isolate also those who have had contact with them. And at that point, it is necessary to know that someone has become ill. Therefore, it is important that doctors are held accountable, and that when there is a strange case, they inform the authorities, because it could be the plague. And we must also know when there is plague elsewhere. We need to have a network of information that comes in, because if we are in Alba, and we know that there is plague in Turin, then guard posts are set up on the roads, and no one is allowed to come along the road from Turin. And so, information, isolation, and quarantine for those arriving from areas where there might be a risk, all these measures are put in place, starting from the end of the Middle Ages. It is the Italian municipalities that, having the most advanced administrative apparatus and administrative culture in the world at that time, are the first to implement these measures. Italian municipalities establish permanent health offices tasked with monitoring the situation. The rest of Europe follows a bit later. Scandinavia, which today is much more advanced than us. In Denmark, waits until the early 1500s to consider that they might try to implement some measures like quarantine and isolation. But they do so initially only to protect the king and the court. Only at the end of the 16th century does it occur to people that perhaps generalized measures could be taken to protect public health. Outside of Europe, even less so in the Muslim world. In the Ottoman Empire, which then governs much of the Muslim world, overlooking the Mediterranean, and which is a sophisticated and highly cultured empire, this Western idea that prevention is possible and worth pursuing does not take hold. Due to administrative inefficiency, probably even more than fatalism, they do not take action. And the result is that even in the 19th century, the plague is still present in the Arab and Turkish world. Napoleon meets her when he goes to Egypt. Napoleon finds the plague, and some of his soldiers fall ill. Then in the mid-19th century, the Turkish Empire also begins to modernize, with reformers arriving who say, let's do the same as in Europe. They also start with quarantines, and the plague disappears there as well. And naturally, so to speak, this is our only explanation. These measures generally worked. They ensured that the disease gradually proliferated less and weakened. When the countermeasures were applied properly, all the recent major plague epidemics I mentioned earlier can generally be contained within a single city with some effort, but they all arise from negligence. Why? Because applying the measures rigidly, as today was also bothersome back then. Even then, businesses were suffering. Even then, entrepreneurs were protesting. Even then, the authorities had to think twice before saying to close everything. And even then, there were those who obviously tried to circumvent the countermeasures. The plague of Marseille in 1720 breaks out because a ship from Syria docks in the port of Marseille. And in Syria, there is the plague. So quarantine. However, there is a perishable cargo. That is very valuable, and in the end, the authorities are convinced to shorten the quarantine. From the ship, the plague descends to the land with the goods. And even there, before saying, let's close everything for the plague, they think about it. Why? Because there are significant interests in not doing it. In the end, they do it, but it's too late. It has already spread and is devastating Provence. One last thing. If you still have 10 minutes of patience, the very last thing I wanted to tell you is how in the past, these epidemics not only caused dramatic transformations, but also proved to be an opportunity to rethink certain mechanisms of the economy and society, favoring those who were able to understand what the new trends were. Let me explain better. One thing that must be said, which may sound very cynical, and I hope you will forgive me, is that an epidemic like the plague of 1348, which takes away perhaps even half of the population in Florence, if not half, then a third. Now, it's not to scare me, but do you understand what it would mean? It would mean, let's take a count. You yes, you know, you yes, you know, you yes, you know, there you go. A great deal of terrifying pain. It happens that we sometimes recount these things with a smile due to our passion for studying and understanding them, but it is clear that we are aware of the burden of suffering that comes with an epidemic. However, it must also be said that when it is over, people look around. They have inherited everything. The amount of available housing, buildings, businesses, goods, precious fabrics, and currency has remained the same as it was before. It's just that we are now half as many to share it. And when I reopen my shop, my competitor is dead. We start again. The problem, as I was saying, is that the plague returns again 10 years later. So in reality, we start over. But in Barcelona, it feels like a struggle, and it's always a bit difficult. But the significant consequences are structural when it becomes evident that the population has now decreased compared to before, and there is nothing to be done. Interesting things happen here. Imagine the typical wool industrialist who, after the epidemic is over, wants to restart. The wool industry is the dominant industry in our cities during the Middle Ages. It is an industry in every sense, in that it is organized on a large scale. Of course, it does not have machines. It has some machines, hydraulic machines, powered by rivers and canals to press the fabrics. But most of the work is manual, of course, and there is no shed where the workers are concentrated. But there is the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur is the one who imports wool in bulk from southern Italy, from Spain, and later from England. Every day, caravans of mules arrive loaded with sacks of raw wool. Then it is given to be worked on, and there is a whole processing phase. It needs to be washed, combed, cleaned, and then woven, and there are specialized workers for all these activities who work from home. The master distributes the work, then moves on to collect, distributes for the next phase to other workers, and so on. Now imagine what happens. The owner reopens, contacts the workers, and the first one he goes to look for doesn't respond to anyone. They say all are dead, say the neighbors. The second one who goes to look opens and says, "Ah, great master, we start working again, very well. I am ready. But there is one thing. Those 10 coins a day that you used to pay me are no longer enough. I want 12. The master's reaction is to say, "Forget it, scoundrels. Always ready to take advantage. I go to the next one. The next one is dead. There is none." Then there's another one who says, "But the competitor has already hired me, paying 13 coins a day." At this point, the normal reaction of employers is to first say, "Of course there is a crisis. We can't take it anymore. These masses of good-for-nothings, these scoundrels who are our employees, now they even want a salary increase. But I know how to deal with them. We go to the local authority and say, please make us a nice law that sets a maximum cap on wages, which prevents competition from paying so much." They do it. It's useless. Competitors, if they want laborers, must pay. The same goes for the countryside, where the owner of the wheat fields, who is already pulling his hair out because so many people have died, finds that there is not as much demand in the good years. Fortunately, every now and then, the big ones arrive in the bad years. There is little wheat, and so prices skyrocket. In short, in the good years, moreover, the laborers want to be paid more than before. Before the plague, you would go to the square in the morning, and it was full of unemployed people, waiting for someone to give them work for a pittance, like today's immigrants who pick our fruit. However, you can no longer find them, and those who are ready to work want to be paid more. The employers are furious, but then they pay the workers better. The laborers of the 1300s, 1400s, and up to the beginning of the 1500s are paid better, the agricultural workers in the countryside, compared to their grandparents long ago. What do they do with this money? First, one eats to their fill. And it wasn't like that before. It wasn't certain at all. If one had too many children, on a daily wage, it was not guaranteed that they could fill everyone's belly. Now, God willing, we all eat our fill. Bread and soup, of course, but we eat to our satisfaction. And after everyone has eaten their fill, the worker has some money left in his pocket. What does he do? Once I told more or less this story at a meeting of managers from I don't remember which company. When I asked them to try to respond and imagine the laborer who has a little money left in his pocket, what does he do? One of them replied, he invests. No, he doesn't invest. He goes to the tavern. He goes to the tavern and drinks wine, and the wine trade is doing wonderfully, while the wheat trade, as mentioned, is struggling. But the wine trade is thriving. New taverns are opening, and they are always full of customers. Those who produce wine in the countryside notice that business is going very well. The city wants wine and keeps bringing in more and more. Then the worker returns home in the evening, and his wife goes rummaging in his pockets, and there are still a few coins left over. What do they do with them? On Sunday, we eat meat, and maybe also on Saturday. No. They used to do Friday and Saturday, excuse me. I'm losing track of my abstinence. Of course, fasting also on Saturday. Thursday at that point, or Wednesday, we eat meat. It was difficult before. Now there is money to do it. And we have the evidence, because we have the tax records of all the businesses that existed in an Italian city at the end of the 1300s and in the 1400s. All the shops open, full of butcheries. There were more butcher shops in Asti or Alexandria in the 1400s than there are today. They essentially ate sheep. Sheep, lamb, ram, rarely cattle, but in short, they ate meat. Butchers make a lot of money, and those who raise livestock in the countryside are also making money. The city wants more and more livestock. At this point, those who are in the countryside, and once it is understood how things are going, one starts to say, why should I continue producing wheat when the market is not what it used to be, and it requires so much labor that wants to be paid? I will just take out the wheat fields, create nice meadows, and raise livestock. However, the meadows need to be irrigated because a dry meadow is worth nothing and yields nothing. If I want to have 2 or 3 good hay harvests, I need to irrigate them. It requires water. We need to invest, and we will invest in irrigation channels. that already existed before, because throughout the Middle Ages, there was a tremendous effort in our countryside to dig irrigation channels and make the land more fertile. However, from the 1300s onwards, there is a significant leap forward. Political initiatives are also starting to emerge, with large canals being dug under government orders. The network of irrigation channels, or biler as you might call them around here, is expanding more and more meadows, marshes, pastures, and livestock, to the point that some begin to say, you know what, I can also make cheese from this. Initially, cheese was made only in the mountains, in the alpine pastures. During the Renaissance, it was also made in the Po Valley, in Piacenza. They make a wonderful cheese, Piacentino, which even the sultans have sent to Constantinople. Then, as Piacenza is consumed by Parma, the cheese changes its name and everyone calls it Parmesan. However, the name Piacentino was originally widespread. Nevertheless, the Po Valley begins to produce cheeses, and those who have understood that this is the trend, just as those who have realized that the vineyard is thriving and that wine must be made, well, they make money. Finally, let's wrap it up. Every evening when the worker or laborer returned from the tavern, his wife would take a leftover coin and put it in the piggy bank. By the end of the year, they have a bit of money saved. What do they do? We go to the fabric merchant, and for once we get ourselves a proper suit. Because until now, poor people dressed in fabrics made at home. All the peasant women had looms and made rough, undyed fabrics. Instead, they wore those. But now, if we have the money, we want to afford a proper outfit. Of course, not like those of the rich. We go to the fabric merchant. We do not want velvets. We do not want brocades. We do not want silk. Those are things for the nobility. We want a nice, durable cloth that holds up, even if it is not of high quality. There you go. Result. Those textile production centers, like Florence, that stubbornly continue to produce luxury fabrics for wealthy clients, are getting by just so-so. But there are plenty of places where the prevailing trends have been understood, and where centers of textile production are emerging, where the official regulations state that poor quality cloth is produced. The cities of the Po Valley, even here in Piedmont, Racconigi and Pinerolo, begin to prosper. Corporations of wool producers are formed, and they state in their statutes that our cloth should not cost more than that level because we aim for that. They do not specify that target, God bless, but what they mean to say is just that. And those who understand this prosper. So it is obviously not to conclude at all costs with a forced message of optimism, because all these beautiful things can only happen after the population has been halved. We will need to find other resources to be optimistic in the current situation. But I still thought this was the right way to conclude. Thank you.